In the quiet town of Willow Creek, people trusted their bank the way they trusted the local church. It was a place of security, a place where hard-earned savings were kept safe. And at the center of that trust was Frank Hargrove, the well-dressed, soft-spoken bank manager who everyone said had a smile that could calm a storm. But behind that calm exterior, Frank was hiding something that would shatter the town's faith in him forever. The first sign of trouble came one Friday morning when a single mother named Carla Simmons walked into the bank to withdraw the last of her savings to pay for her daughter's surgery. But when the teller checked her account, her balance was almost empty. Confused and humiliated, Carla demanded answers. But Frank assured her it was a technical glitch and told her to come back on Monday. What Carla didn't know was that her missing money was only the beginning. By Monday morning, 3 more customers had reported missing funds, small accounts at first, nothing that would attract national attention. But in a town where everyone knew each other, the whispers started. People began asking questions. Questions Frank didn't want anyone asking. Meanwhile, a quiet, overlooked employee named Jeremy Cole had been working late shifts at the bank. Jeremy was the kind of person no one noticed, shy, reserved, often eating lunch alone in the break room. But Jeremy had a secret of his own. He had been watching Frank for months. Ever since he noticed discrepancies in account logs that didn't add up. Money moved in tiny amounts, but always in the same pattern, and always during Frank's night access sessions. Jeremy gathered evidence quietly, printing transaction histories, backing up security footage, keeping everything hidden in a box under his bed. He didn't trust anyone, not even the police at first, because Frank had connections, city council members, wealthy clients. Even the mayor called him a pillar of the community. Who would believe Jeremy, the invisible junior clerk, over the most respected man in town? The tension exploded 2 weeks later when an elderly couple, the Bennetts, came into the bank crying. Their entire retirement account, nearly $80,000, had been drained overnight. This time, the local news got involved, cameras showed up at the bank, and the pressure was on Frank to explain. But he smiled into the cameras and said the bank's systems had been targeted by hackers, and they were, working tirelessly to restore every penny. Jeremy watched that interview from the break room, and something inside him snapped. He knew Frank wasn't just lying. He was stealing from people who trusted him, people who could lose everything. And so Jeremy made a decision that would change everything. He anonymously leaked the security footage he had collected to a state investigator. The footage showed Frank, late at night, entering restricted areas, accessing accounts, and transferring funds into a shell account linked to a fake business. The investigation was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, state authorities arrived at the bank with a warrant. Employees watched in shock as Frank was let out in handcuffs, his perfect hair disheveled, his confident smile gone. The town erupted in disbelief. How could this man, the man who sponsored the church choir, who hosted community picnics, be capable of such betrayal? But here's where the story takes a dark twist. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered this wasn't just theft. Frank was laundering money for a much larger criminal network, and some of that money was being used to fund violent crimes in neighboring towns. Suddenly, Frank's arrest wasn't just about stolen savings. It was about stopping a chain of crime that could have turned deadly. Jeremy became an unlikely hero. Reporters camped outside his house. Neighbors thanked him for his courage. But Jeremy wasn't celebrating. He knew Frank wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly. And sure enough, 2 weeks after Frank's arrest, Jeremy found a note under his windshield, written in bold letters. "You think this is over?" That night, Jeremy couldn't sleep. He kept checking the locks on his door, jumping at every sound outside, because deep down, he knew Frank still had friends on the outside, people with power, people who might come looking for him. And as the investigation widened, one name kept coming up, a name Jeremy recognized. Someone inside the bank, still working there, still covering for Frank. And that's where this story leaves us. Jeremy standing at his window, watching a dark car slowly drive by his house at midnight, his phone buzzing with a new message from an unknown number that simply reads. Jeremy barely slept that night. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a threat. Every passing car made his heart pound. By morning, he decided he couldn't just sit back and wait for something to happen. So he went to the state investigators with the threatening note and the text message. They told him they would look into it. But Jeremy could tell from their tone that he was low on their priority list. Frank was in custody, they said, and the case was airtight, but Jeremy knew better. He knew Frank's reach went further than anyone realized. At the bank, things were tense, employees were whispering, customers were still panicking about their missing money, and the interim manager was trying to reassure everyone that things were back to normal. But Jeremy noticed something strange. Certain account adjustments were still happening after hours. Even though Frank was behind bars, it meant someone else had access, someone who was continuing the operation, and that terrified Jeremy more than anything. He stayed late one night, pretending to finish paperwork, and sure enough, just after midnight, someone swiped into the restricted account room. Jeremy crept closer, his hands shaking, and peeked through the glass panel. To his shock, it was Linda, the bank's senior loan officer, a woman everyone respected, a woman who had mentored Jeremy when he first started. Linda was transferring funds into the same shell accounts Frank had used, but she wasn't alone. On the desk was a burner phone, and through the faint speaker Jeremy heard Frank's voice giving instructions from jail. Jeremy's stomach dropped. It wasn't over, not even close. Frank was running the scheme from inside a cell, and Linda was his mole on the outside. Jeremy backed away, heart pounding. Knowing if Linda saw him, he might not make it out of the bank alive. He drove straight home, locked the door, and spent the night debating whether to go public with what he had seen. The next morning, Jeremy made the riskiest move of his life. He called the local news station and agreed to go on record as the whistleblower. His interview aired that evening, Jeremy on camera, tired, pale, but determined, saying, "Frank may be in jail, but this isn't over. Someone inside the bank is still helping him steal from this community." The fallout was immediate. Investigators returned to the bank, this time with more warrants. They seized computers, froze accounts, and placed Linda under surveillance. But Linda was smart. Too smart. She wiped her phone, destroyed files, and even managed to make Jeremy look like he was the one altering accounts. Suddenly, Jeremy went from hero to suspect. Headlines started asking if the so-called whistleblower was actually involved from the start. The pressure became unbearable. Jeremy's neighbors stopped waving, co-workers avoided him, and his own boss placed him on indefinite leave. While the investigation continued, he was alone, broke, and now a target from both sides. He started receiving phone calls late at night. Always silence on the other end. Always just long enough to make him feel watched. One evening, Jeremy came home to find his apartment door slightly open. He froze, every instinct telling him to run, but he stepped inside carefully. The place looked untouched, until he saw the box under his bed where he kept his evidence. It was gone. In its place was a single piece of paper with just 3 words written in red ink: "Stop or die." Jeremy knew he had to get out. He packed a small bag and drove to his sister's cabin outside of town, thinking he could lay low. But even there, he wasn't safe. The second night, he was awakened by the sound of gravel crunching under tires. Headlights swept across the window, and a black SUV idled in the driveway for a full minute before pulling away. By now, Jeremy realized he couldn't just react. He had to fight back. He contacted a trusted reporter from a national outlet and shared everything he knew, including what he had seen Linda doing that night at the bank. The reporter agreed to dig deeper, and within days they uncovered phone records linking Linda to a prepaid number traced back to Frank's prison wing. It was the proof investigators needed. Linda was arrested in a dramatic early morning raid, her house swarmed by agents, neighbors looking on in shock. Jeremy watched the news footage with a mix of relief and fear, because if Linda had been arrested, Frank would know exactly who had exposed her, and Jeremy's name would be at the top of his list. Sure enough, within 24 hours, Jeremy received a letter at the cabin, no return address, no stamp, just left on the porch. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It showed Jeremy's sister leaving her house, unaware she was being watched. On the back was written, "You can't protect everyone." Jeremy dropped the photo and felt cold dread wash over him. This wasn't just about him anymore. His family was now in danger. He grabbed his phone, ready to call the investigators, but before he could dial, he noticed something. The same black SUV was now parked at the end of the dirt road. The shocking betrayal that no one saw coming, and whether Jeremy survives the night or becomes the next victim in Frank's revenge. Jeremy stood frozen at the doorway, the cool night air cutting through him, his heart thundering in his chest. The SUV door opened slowly, and a man stepped out. Not a stranger, but Officer Grant, one of the local cops Jeremy had reported the threats to just weeks earlier. But instead of relief, Jeremy felt fear, because Grant wasn't in uniform. He was wearing dark clothes, no badge, and in his hand was something that glinted in the moonlight. Grant called out quietly, "Jeremy, we need to talk," his tone calm, almost friendly, but Jeremy didn't move. He tightened his grip on the photo, refusing to let Grant close the distance. "You're working with him, aren't you?" Jeremy's voice cracked. Grant's expression didn't change. He just said, You've made this worse for yourself and for everyone." At that moment, the cabin's back door burst open and two state investigators stormed in, weapons drawn, shouting for Jeremy to get down. Chaos erupted. Grant tried to run but was tackled. The SUV roared to life and sped away into the night. The investigators pinned Grant to the ground, handcuffed him, and dragged him to his feet. It turned out Jeremy's national reporter contact had alerted federal authorities, and they had been tailing the SUV for days, waiting for Frank's network to make a move. Grant wasn't just dirty, he was the key to everything. His phone held messages directly from Frank, detailing the threats, the orders to silence Jeremy, even a plan to move Linda's case files so she could walk free. With Grant in custody, the entire scheme unraveled. More arrests followed, including 2 prison guards who had been smuggling phones to Frank, and finally, the state announced that Frank would face additional charges: conspiracy, witness intimidation, and money laundering. Charges that meant he would never walk free again. Jeremy testified at the trial, his voice shaking but clear, describing how Frank had turned a bank into a personal cash machine and tried to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The jury didn't take long to deliver a guilty verdict, and when the judge handed down a life sentence without parole, the courtroom erupted in cheers. For the first time in months, Jeremy felt the weight lift off his chest. But even in victory, Jeremy couldn't shake the sense that this story had changed him forever. He moved out of Willow Creek, started over in another town, and used his settlement money to help victims who had lost their savings rebuild their lives. He became an advocate for stronger banking oversight, speaking at conferences and warning others about the dangers of blind trust. Yet one thing still haunts him. A week after the trial, Jeremy received one last letter. No threats, no photos, just a single sentence written in neat handwriting. "You may have won this round, but there are more of us." Jeremy burned the letter, but sometimes at night, he still looks out the window, half expecting to see headlights waiting at the end of the road, because deep down, he knows this wasn't just about one bank manager. It was about a network, one that might still be out there. And that's where this case ends. Or maybe it doesn't, because stories like this remind us that corruption doesn't disappear overnight. It hides, waits, and strikes again when no one is watching. What do you think? Was Jeremy brave or reckless for going public? And do you believe Frank's network is really gone? Or could there be more names on that list that we never discovered? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more cases like this, subscribe to Behind Crime Scene so you never miss the next deep dive into the crimes that hide in plain sight.